Hey YouTube, fun fact, Gardens of the Moon was actually originally written to be a screenplay, which I think is crazy, and you'll see why on this spoiler-free review of the book, Gardens of the Moon. Gardens of the Moon, first book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Now, first things first, obviously I love this series. I've dedicated an entire YouTube page to talking about it, its themes, the books, so I love it. And it's hard for me to be objective about a book that introduced me to this world that I love so much. However, that doesn't mean that I don't think I can recognize some of the negatives that are there in this book. And there are those negatives. Now, if you go on Reddit and search for best books in Malazan Book of the Fallen, or you just look at the ratings on Goodreads, you'll recognize pretty quickly Gardens of the Moon is not a favorite. Now, it's not widely panned or anything, but most people, when they talk about the great books in the series, are not going to mention Gardens of the Moon. However, I don't think that means it's a bad book or anything like that. It's still a great book and a great intro to the world itself. However, you do need to go in with eyes open, and I think I can help you recognize some of the weaknesses and prepare for them through this video. My basic overview about this book is that the weaknesses that are portrayed here, I have good news for you. This is the weakest book in the series on those points. Things like writing style, things like how complicated the world is or how complicated it seems, how you're thrown into something without knowing what's going on. Gardens of the Moon is going to be the hardest in that aspect. Erikson does that a lot in his books, but as you go through the series, you become more and more comfortable with the world. And here's the good news. The strengths, as you read this book, are the world itself. The originality, the creativity, how massive it feels, and that strength, as you go through the series, only gets better. So I really think Gardens of the Moon is a worthwhile read, and it's an especially worthwhile reread if you've read the series through. I myself have read it a couple of times, and it keeps getting better each time, and I think that's the show of a really great book. All right, let's talk plot. And I'm going to be as general as possible here because, again, this is a spoiler-free review. This book is actually the most traditional as far as plot structure of any of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. There is an introduction with a nice big action set piece that brings you into the action, and then there's a middle portion that really sort of explains more broadly what's going on and sets up a third act that is full of almost cinematic excitement, and a lot of things happen, and a convergence of a lot of the characters you've been following. And that's the conclusion and a real page turner towards the end. Erikson is not always going to write in that traditional structure. In fact, generally he sort of purposefully writes outside of that structure. However, in this book, as I think a help to the reader, he does introduce in that basic structure. The first part is in a city called Pale, where the Malazan Empire is trying to overtake this free, independent city. There's this big battle. I won't tell you what happens in it, but what happens there means the Malazans need to move on to another city, and they move to Darujistan, and that is where the rest of the book is going to take place. The middle is going to be, again, setting up sort of that final conflict in Darujistan. As I already mentioned, there's kind of two main groups of characters, and there's characters that fall in each of these categories, a lot of different characters that you're going to meet. One category is the Malazan Empire. You're going to meet a lot of soldiers there, a lot of commanders, some mages. They all fall into the Malazans. They're trying to take over Darujistan. The other people you're going to meet, the Darus, those who live in Darujistan, and you guessed it, they're trying to keep the Empire from taking over their city. But the great thing about Malazan in general, and this book specifically, is that basic plot, there's always way more complicated things happening underneath for every single character. For the Darujistans, for example, there are some people who are trying to defend the city, but then there also are some people who are trying to defend the city kind of, but also getting in good positions where if the city is taken over, they can survive or they can even be powerful. And there's a lot of intrigue there depending on the party that you're talking about. Over with the Malazans, yes, there's an army trying to take over Darujistan, but there's also, most of our heroes fall under a particular unit called the Bridge Burners, and they're starting to think there are some people that could be stabbing them in the back in the Empire. But they don't know specifics, they don't know who, and they suspect why, but they're not sure. So there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes as you're reading about this main conflict. And that's really a strength of Malazan always, is sort of the depth of plot. And here's where we need to talk about those first 150 to 200 pages. Just a warning, it's gonna be rough. Erikson really throws you into the deep end, and even the prose themselves are very dense, and at times it feels like every single sentence you read is almost incoherent because you don't understand what each of the words means in context of the whole world and universe that you have found yourself in. This is Erikson transitioning from being a short story author to being a novelist. When you write short stories, you don't have as much time to build the world, so you have to make every sentence count. The problem is, if you write like that for a novel, a 500 or 700 page novel, eventually your reader is going to get exhausted, and that is what happens sometimes in Gardens of the Moon. The good news is that I think Erikson definitely improves on this, even right away in Dead House Gates, the next book in the Malazan series. And by the end, it is just gorgeous. He's found that perfect balance of still having very complicated and beautiful prose, but also being much more readable. So just know that that is not going to be throughout the series. Really, Gardens of the Moon is the hardest prose, so if you can get through that, I think you're really going to be able to enjoy the series as a whole. Enough talking about weaknesses, because I want to talk about the strengths of this book, because like I said earlier, I love this book. Each and every element in this book is creative as it's amazing. The setting, even though they're just cities, they feel so lived in, they feel so unique. They're small details that aren't even dwelt on are so different from other fantasy that you have read. The magic system, the Warrens, again, you're never going to be sat down and explained it. You're just going to see and you're going to feel that wonder of, wow, magic. And it's really an amazing feeling, because you've never seen anything like this in a novel. Guarantee it. I'm not talking about elves or dwarves or giants or sort of the more traditional fantasy races and types, because Erikson just creates his own. I'm going to be talking about Tistandi. I'm going to be talking about Jaggets. I'm going to be, talking about words that don't mean anything if you haven't read the Malazan series. And I think that's amazing, because they are all so different, again, from what you've seen. The characters themselves are incredibly unique. Just one I want to mention is Krupp. This kind of hilarious, doofy, weird character that is maybe powerful, maybe not. You kind of figure out as you read, but it's such a unique way that this guy talks and thinks is so much fun to be put in his head. So the creativity in Gardens of the Moon is amazing. Love it, love it, love it. I also want to recognize that while Acts 1 and 2 are sometimes hard to get through and complicated and you're going to feel lost, by Act 3, while there are still elements that are going to be new that you're not going to exactly understand, it's a page-turner. He brings together all these characters and this conflict into a really great finale that the reader has to love, and you're really going to flip through it wanting to know what is happening. So you will be rewarded, even in this one volume, for your reading through the more complicated parts. So keep going, always keep going. So conclusion to this Gardens of the Moon spoiler-free review. Again, my overall thoughts on this are there are weaknesses here, but just know that those weaknesses get better as the series progresses, so I don't think you should let that stop you. And there are some amazing strengths. It is creative. You are going to be involved in cultures and characters and settings that you have never experienced before as a fantasy reader. Now, I do want to give away a little secret here. I actually, the first time I read Gardens of the Moon, I enjoyed it, but I put it down and didn't go on in the series because I thought those weaknesses were a little too much. I didn't want to work that hard all throughout this very long series. And it took years before I came back, tried it again, and then went into Dead House Gates, the next book. So that's why I'm really harping on this point. There might be some negatives in Gardens of the Moon, but it gets so much better, and it's so worth it. So keep going. That said, I do acknowledge that the Malazan Book of the Fallen as a whole is not for everybody, and that is also true of Gardens of the Moon. It helps if you know that you like fantasy, particularly high or big fat fantasy, whatever you want to call it. If you know you like that, you've read a couple in the genre, you've read Wheel of Time, or you've read Lord of the Rings, Dune, some of these other sort of landmark series, and really enjoyed it, I think that's going to help a lot when you go into Malazan. I don't think it's necessary, but I think it's really going to help. It's also going to help if you like, probably a good word for it is ponderous fantasy, meaning that fantasy that really reflects on some deeper themes, not just focused on a really cool plot. There is really cool plot devices, but Erikson is also interested in really dwelling on some of the deeper elements of fantasy and human existence, and so at times he's going to sit and think on some things where some other fantasy might move forward to other happenings. I often describe the series to people as being like A Song of Ice and Fire meets Dostoevsky in a series. So if that sounds like it's for you, Gardens of the Moon is going to be for you, and definitely the whole Malazan series is going to be for you.
What say you?
Strongly recommend this book. Final score, 7 out of 10. It's a great book with its weaknesses, but especially because it introduces you to this massive, massive world of the Malazan series. I definitely strongly recommend it. I know, no surprise, given the nature of this channel. But I also did want to give some resources to help you on your first reread especially. First, Tor, the publisher, did a series they called The Reread of the Fallen. You just Google that phrase, Reread of the Fallen. They go through each chapter of Gardens of the Moon, in fact, every book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and discuss it. Now be careful because the discussions do have spoilers. So if you're a first-time reader, I would say don't read the descriptions or the discussion going on there. But at the beginning of each section, they have a brief summary of the chapter that they're going to talk about. Just read those. They're like one paragraph long, very clear descriptions of what happens. If you're feeling lost, that's a really great resource. Secondly, if you just want a community to kind of experience this with, but you don't have friends or people around you who want to read a 10-page huge epic fantasy series, check out the podcast 10 Very Big Books. There are 3 people that are reading through them, 2 of them for the first time, and one of those first-time readers doesn't even like reading fantasy generally. So it's a really great spectrum of readers and people who are going to enjoy, or maybe at times not enjoy, the series as a whole. So it's a really great resource, again, especially for first-time readers. Thank you guys so much for joining me for this spoiler-free review of the first Malazan Book of the Fallen, Gardens of the Moon. Check it out, and definitely please subscribe to this channel, become part of the community. Leave your thoughts of Gardens of the Moon in the comments below. Like this video. We're just starting out. We're really excited to start building this Malazan community here on YouTube.